Uh, my variables are first is dependent variable admission test parts. There are four. For the independent variable, I have sex. Bachelor's program, there are six. And then student type, whether it's full-time or part-time. For the first part, I'll be discussing about the descriptive statistics. So table 1, this is the overall descriptive statistics of admission test scores of students by part of the test. So first, as you can see, the verbal test got the lowest mean score with only 2.277, and quantitative test where the average score is a bit low. And for the students, for the standard deviation, student scores from verbal tests are not far from each other compared to the scores in essay tests where scores are widely scattered. So the result shows that the first two parts, these are only over 15. So I made a comparison between the two. And then for the second part, it's over 20. So I also made a comparison which one got the highest. Um, Next is for the descriptive statistics, dependent variables by sex. So this table shows scores of different parts of the test in relation to sex. As the table shows, we can say that both sex did fairly satisfactory for verbal type of test and quantitative test, and satisfactory for analytical and essay. However, we can clearly see with the mean scores that their scores are the male scores are way higher than the female scores. So I have here, it says that it negates the study of Young in 1999, whose studies found out that female learners had more strategy awareness compared to other sex. For the admission test scores, it shows that male learners or male test takers got better results. However, if you look at the standard deviation for the quantitative and essay part, male scores are more scattered, which means that other male students got a very low score, other students got very high score. Although that is also the same for the female during the essay test. Uh, they also have female also got high scores and some got low scores. But looking at the description, they are just the same: fairly satisfactory, satisfactory, fairly satisfactory, and satisfactory. So next is the um there you go. So these are the male. Next, we have the descriptive statistics, verbal, analytical, quantitative essay by bachelor's degree program. Here I have six: math, educational administration, guidance and counseling, public ad, English language teaching, and science education. So this table shows that um, this table shows their mean scores for each part of the test by program. As you can see, guidance and counseling scored lowest for three areas. Among all, only guidance counseling scored the lowest for three areas. Another important information that we can get here is that the English language teaching course got a very satisfactory test for essay. As we can observe, English teachers are really good with their writing skills and explaining themselves. And another one is only math program got a math education, the only program with three satisfactory mean scores, which means that even though they don't get the highest score, they are mostly consistent with their scores. Most are satisfactory. So for other scores, I did not include them since I can only see that these are the mostly significant scores based on the mean and standard deviation. So next is the descriptive statistics by student type. So here you can see that part-time students got low scores. Oh, sorry. Part-time students got low scores compared to the full-time students. Full-time students have highest mean score, And the essay got very satisfactory. The score is really high. For the standard deviation, full-time student scores are uh, greatly scattered, except for analytical. Their scores are close to each other, but for the rest, their scores are really scattered, more scattered than the part-time students. So that's it for the descriptive statistics. For my inferential statistics, ma'am, I'm not really quite sure if I did it right. Uh, for the inferential
Just
statistics,
present.
this is the correlation. First, the correlation significant variables are only one, verbal and quantitative. As you can see that the p-value is less than 0.05 for verbal and quantitative, which got 0.02, and verbal and essay have 0.05. So the least significant among all, which does not have any relationship at all, is the analytical and verbal. As you can see that the p-value is the highest among all. Also, quantitative and essay was almost, as the p-value is 0.051, but considering the number, it's already more than 0.05. So next is the regression. For the regression, I really had a hard time finding out so how to discuss this one. Table 6 regression analysis, verbal versus the rest. So alternative hypothesis, the null hypothesis here is rejected because the verbal test is the only variable that significantly affects the quantitative test. I'm not really sure, ma'am, if I stated it right, because students perform well in quantitative as they do for verbal test. So as you can see, the p-value is 0.02. So only that. The rest of the other variables does not affect or is not significant for the verbal test. Next is analytical versus the rest of the variables. The null hypothesis is accepted since none of the variables significantly affect the analytical test. The p-value are all more than 0.05. For the quantitative, the case here is that verbal test is the only variable that significantly affects the quantitative, which rejects the null hypothesis. On For the quantitative versus verbal, the coefficient is positive and the t-value is also high. This is one student perform well for quantitative tests, so they also perform well in verbal test. The p-value is less than 0.05, so the null hypothesis is rejected. Another is essay. So I'm not really sure, ma'am, if I interpreted this right because the coefficient is negative, but among
Yeah.
all, the p-value are accepted. They are
Yes,
significant,
yes.
but does this mean,
That's
ma'am, that
correct.
its effect is negative?
No,
Uh,
no, no.
so how should I say this one, ma'am?
Uh, because the coefficient is negative, it means that the essay type of test, no, regardless of sex, the students are actually doing the essay type of test, which means that murag kuan siya ba kaning murag lisod siya i-explain. It's because of the negative value, but the negative value would just mean that as they perform in the essay type of test, no, as male and female, kay sex is classified as male and female,
Yes.
as this variable considered nga sex, as they perform the essay type of test, regardless of whether they are male or female, their answers actually are contributing negatively to the type of essay test, both their answers, no? When we say negative kay kanisya, if you are going to consider the negative effects here, kuan kanang as we relate it to the correlation nga as one variable increases, the other
Mm.
decreases. Mao na siya, di ba? The concept of having that negative. But in the regression, the negative effects, the negative sign here is not similar to the correlation when we interpret it.
Mm.
It means that as they improve in the essay type of test, then some of the scores of the students, regardless whether they are male or female, fluctuate. Ang uban taas, ang uban mubo in terms of the essay type of test. Ana siya. Which is similar also to student type. Ang student type, what are the groupings of the student type gani dyan?
There are math, guidance counseling, public ad, English language
Oh,
teaching, science, and
so
mathematics.
in other words, there are varied, no? Varied responses to that essay type of test. Some scored better, some scored low. And if you can really eyeball the data, that would be clear nga varied ang ilang responses. Dili gyud siya bitaw unidirectional or inversely proportional. Ang uban taas, ang uban mubo.
Mm.
Ana.
Okay.
So that's how you are going to consider the negative coefficient. Mm.
Okay, ma'am. Thank you so much, ma'am.
Oo. Okay.
That is also the case when we had the sex versus the others. The coefficient is negative, but the
Mm-mm.
null hypothesis is rejected
Ay,
since.
Jan,
Yes, ma'am.
excuse me. Do not consider sex as your dependent variable. Kanirang mga
Yes.
oh, so you need not do this one. Do not include this because you cannot utilize the independent variable as one of your regression
Yes.
variable, the main regression variable. Kay kuan naman ni sila independent. So
Yes.
katulad mga dependent variables the scores.
Ah.
Taman
Okay,
ra
ma'am.
ka sa essay. Oo.
Okay, ma'am.
Dili na ni ang sex, ang program, ang student type, no need to do regression. They will just be utilized as independent variables, whether they will contribute, they will have some influence in their performances in the different subject and the different type of tests, whether verbal, analytical, quantitative, or
Okay, ma'am.
essay. But do not use this as a criterion variable. Dili
Okay,
na
ma'am.
siya. So, taman ra ka sa essay.
Yes, ma'am. Diha ako naglibog sa
Okay.
regression, ma'am, kay unsaan ako siya pag-explain, ma'am ba?
Oo. Oo,
Okay,
medyo
so wala din ni siya, ma'am. Okay.
wala na na. Oo.
Thank you
Sige,
so
two
much, ma'am.
sample na. Yes.
So that's it for the regression. Now we will have the two sample t-test. The two sample t-test will start with verbal and sex. The null hypothesis is accepted since the p-value is greater than 0.05. Thus, there is no significant difference between sex for verbal tests. Their scores are not significant, whether you're a male or a female. That is also the case. The null hypothesis is accepted for analytical and sex. Even if you're a male or a female, your score for analytical sex does not affect your score is not affected by your sex for the analytical. Now for the quantitative, it's also the same. The p-value is is greater, thus your sex does not affect, or there's no significance difference for sex between sex for quantitative test. However, for the yes, not yet here. For the essay and sex, the p-value is also not uh, less than 0.05, but it was almost. But still, the null hypothesis is accepted because it's greater than 0.05. So there is no significance between sex for verbal test. But as we look at the mean The male got higher, but still, it says that the p-value is not is saying that there's no significant difference between the two. Next is we have the student type between full-time and part-time. The null hypothesis here is rejected. There is a significant difference between full-time and part-time students. As you can see, the mean of the full-time students are way higher than part-time students. Thus, if you're a full-time student, you may get a higher score for the verbal test. For the analytical test, it is rejected. It is not. The null hypothesis is not rejected. Student type has no difference for analytical test. For the quantitative, on the other hand, the null hypothesis is rejected since the p-value is greater than 0.05 and the t-value is high. There is a significant difference between sex, or this is not sex, this is for the student type in the quantitative test. So this is not sex. Um, if you are a part-time student, as you can see, the mean score is higher. Thus, your score for quantitative test may get better results if you're a full-time student. Next, for the essay, as you can see, the value is 0.00, which is very significant. The null hypothesis is rejected since the p-value is greater than 0.05 and the t-value is really high. It's very high compared to the other t-values. There is significance, as you can see, that the full-time students got very high mean scores than the part-time students, although there is a high deviation, standard deviation, but the mean score is really high compared to those who are only part-time students. That's it for the t-test. Now we will go to the Anova, the last part of this presentation. One-way Anova, verbal versus program. So the null hypothesis here is accepted. The program is not a factor for getting better results for a verbal test. So whatever program you are in, your score does not differ. This is also the case for the analytical test. The null hypothesis is accepted. Program is not a factor for the analytical test to get better scores in this part. This is also the same for quantitative. The null hypothesis is accepted. Program is not a factor for getting better results or scores for quantitative test. However, for the essay versus program, the null hypothesis is rejected. It means that some or one program is a factor for getting better results for the essay part. As you have seen for the descriptive statistics, we have the English language teaching, which their mean score is 14, the highest among all, which got a very satisfactory score or quantitative description. Thus, it can be an advantage for English teachers during the essay part of the test. And that ends my present